Good afternoon. My name is Amelia, and I am in the great presence of Dr. Francisco H. Vázquez, Professor of History of Ideas and Director of the Hutchins Institute for Public Policy Studies and Community Action at Sonoma State University. Dr. Vázquez is also a member of the Community and Local Law Enforcement Task Force. Today we're going to chat about the great work of Cesar Chavez and how it impacted many people, specifically those that come from or were descended from the south of the border, or those that were here when the border crossed them. So let's get to know Dr. Francisco Vázquez. How was it growing up in the 60s?
Well, it was definitely a cultural revolution for everybody. And for me, was more of a cultural shock because in 1964, to be precise, is when we finally settled in Los Angeles. And I was very much a Mexican national, in fact, when I tried to go and register for school, they wouldn't let me register because I didn't have any papers. And so in 1964, if you didn't have any papers, you couldn't go to school. And so I had to wait for almost a year until we got our papers, our green cards. And I didn't know that there was a cultural revolution going on. I just thought that that was just U.S. culture. But everybody's going crazy on the Beatles, and Motown is exploding, and the civil rights movement is going at full speed, and people are being hurt and being killed, and all of these things are happening. And coming in from Mexico, I just thought, well, this is just the United States. This is what goes on. So I didn't know that I was living through revolutionary times, with, men growing their hair long, and, people going barefooted, and, the hippies, and all of that. It was just really, truly fantastic, to go through that. But the one thing that really stays in my mind was, as time went by and I went to college, I think the feeling of the 1960s was that there could be a revolution, that revolution was possible, and that we could, through our actions, make society a better society. And so that was the feeling that, to me, permeated the 1960s.
So you talked about that you thought that was normal. So when did you come to the realization that there was a movement or many movements happening?
When Reagan got elected, then I realized that it was more of it was a swinging, right, from the left to the right, and back and forth. And I'm trying to think of the correct word. It's not like a pendulum, but it's more as a dialectic, right? And so, what I have learned, looking at it from what I know now, it was a tremendous effort to change the world, to change U.S. society from the bottom. But we didn't realize, or we slowly realized, that the machinery, the military machinery of the United States, couldn't really be overcome by popular movement. And Reyes Tijerina, who is not mentioned I don't know if you know Reyes Tijerina. He's been mentioned lately on the news for some kind of anniversary, But he was arguing that the lands that were granted by the Spanish government to the people in Nuevo Mexico, they were supposed to be safeguarded by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So he went and took over a courthouse, and there was a shootout, and somebody got killed, and they sent the army after him. Corky Gonzalez in Colorado, in Denver, Colorado, had the Crusade for Justice, and that was the emphasis of Corky Gonzalez was on culture. It was la cultura, and I was privileged to attend the very first National Youth Conference in Denver, Colorado. And when we got there were 2,000 Chicano youth from all over the United States. And there were some Puerto Rican kids too, from the Young Lords from New York. There were people from Chicago, so there were black berets, green berets, not green berets, brown berets, purple berets, black berets, different, organizations. And it was just really, truly overwhelming. But the thing was that there were armed personnel inside the Crusade for Justice, because during the night people would go by the Crusade for Justice, which used to be a Baptist temple. And they used to shoot at the doors. They shoot through the windows, which were all boarded up. So it was almost like a war going on. And, I was 19 years old, and I was a freshman in college. And if somebody would have given me a rifle and said, this is a revolution, let's go shoot it out with the Marines or whoever, I would have done it. Because that was the feeling, that was the what was happening at the time. So that was Corky Gonzalez, and then Jose Angel Gutierrez was in Crystal City, Texas, organizing the La Raza Unida Party. And then Cesar Chavez had already started with the farm worker movement. So those four people, those four men, and of course Dolores Huerta was with Cesar Chavez, or maybe Cesar Chavez was with Dolores Huerta, I don't know. They were really the core of the Chicano movement. I mean, they were the ones, and so
why?
It showed the strength of the Chicano movement in that, it was Texas, California, and Colorado, and Nuevo Mexico. So it showed, that the entire Southwest was up in arms. But it also showed the fragmentation, because they had different focus.
So,
but you asked me why was it the core of the Chicano movement? Well, there was a dormant period during which most Mexican Americans didn't want their children to learn English. I mean, to learn Spanish.
why was that?
And pretty much throughout the 50s and even the 60s. And it makes a lot of sense if you see that your children would get better treatment and would be more successful if they just speak English. The situation was so dire, and I have a lot of relatives in the Midwest, in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Denver, Colorado, who went through hell, just to be able to coexist with the white majority. And I understand from their experiences that whatever it took to assimilate and be able to survive, they were going to do that.
So what was it like for you as a young adult? What was your experience in the school system and how they treated people that identified as Latino or Chicano or Mexican American?
Well, my first experience was the struggle. And this is just before the Chicano movement. So between 1964 and 1968, there was a lot of struggle. And I wrote a piece a long time ago. I called it Pochos and TJs. Because there was a lot of what we now call sureños and norteños, right? So when I went to junior high, finally, after I got my papers, I had to go from Wilmington, which is right next to Long Beach. Long Beach is a nice area. Wilmington is a working class area. But we had to take the bus. We were not bused. We just took the regular bus to San Pedro. Because they didn't have ESL classes in Wilmington. So I had to go all the way to San Pedro to ESL. And the Mexican Americans, los pochos, they didn't like Mexicans. So as soon as classes were over, we had to run to the depot and take the bus and get the hell out of San Pedro because there would be fights all the time.
Did you ever find out why there was that dislike?
Yeah, there was one time where I got into a confrontation and this guy, definitely wanted to fight. And so I started, making conversation. I didn't want to get into a fight and said, what's your problem? And we were with both Mexicans. And he said, no, he said, I'm an American y los mexicanos me caen peseta. But he said it in Spanish.
Oh.
And I still remember his name was Richard Sanchez, and he was the leader of some kind of a gang in the school. And this is junior high, but it was really serious stuff. People were getting stabbed and beaten severely. So it was that kind of confrontation that made me realize that there were a lot of things that were going on that I didn't understand. I couldn't really comprehend that kind of hatred towards us. And then I remember after junior high, I got a job with the Navy Fuel Depot in San Pedro under President Johnson's youth program. And we were working in maintenance of acres and acres of camouflage. Is basically grassy area and a few bushes here and there, but underneath they're gasoline tanks for the Navy, but they're camouflaged. And so we did all the maintenance, and there were a lot of African Americans working. And one of them was a pastor, a very wise old man. And one time I went up to him and I said, you keep talking about white people in front of me, and I'm wondering, I'm white and you keep talking bad about white people. And he looks at me and he says, you're not white, you're a Mexican. So, so I was learning what my place was in society, right? Because coming from Mexico, and since my family was repatriated in the 1930s, my uncle spoke English, and they interacted with a lot of Anglos because they worked in the tourist industry in Guadalajara. So I was used to seeing Anglo people as equals, and because I'm light-skinned, I always consider myself white.
Did they treat you like an equal, like the people?
In Guadalajara, they did because they were tourists, and they came over to my uncle's house, and he cooked for them and befriended them, and he was kind of like a tour guide. So instead of just taking places, he would take them to his home and treat them like family. So of course, those Anglos would be very nice because people are being nice to them. So, but I never felt any sense of Anglos being superior to me. And so to learn little by little that there was that assumption that Anglos were superior, it was like a big shock to me, and something that I never been able to accept up until today. I just don't feel that.
Was there any disparate treatment just overall, like when you went to the United States?
In the schools, I remember when we transferred, when we finished 1 year of ESL, then we went to high school. That was the 10th grade in those days. That was the freshman year. My friend, who was from Mexico City, and we wanted to be medical doctors. When we got our courses, they were all woodshop and car mechanics and just bullshit courses. So we both walked into the principal's office, threw our cards, our schedule onto his desk, very self-righteous, and said, we want to be medical doctors, we want to take biology, trigonometry, we want to take hard courses. So that was part of my learning process, that we were considered inferior and not capable of doing what they were doing. So, and the school was fairly integrated. There were probably about 1/3 Anglos, 1/3 Mexicans, and African Americans, and there were a huge contingent of Samoans, right? So I didn't get, I think, kind of subtle, unconscious discrimination, or I just felt it as discrimination. But I'll give you an example. The counselor in my high school was trying to explain to me that I was eligible for scholarships because I was disadvantaged. And I didn't like that. I didn't accept that I was disadvantaged in any way. So it was part of, again, my learning process, right? But I ended up actually being accepted at UCLA in high school. But in between my experience in Wilmington in the high school, my parents moved to Santana in Orange County. And because of where they bought a house, I ended up going to a primarily white school, not in Santana, but in Garden Grove. So out of 2,000 students, only 14 Latinos were there. There were no blacks, there were no Asians. It was just 2,000 whites and 14 Latinos. And most of them were Mexican Americans. So nobody talked to me because they didn't deem me, worth talking to. So I went to school and I just ate lunch by myself and did everything by myself. And then I remember listening to teachers saying, Francisco's actually a good student. And the other just saying, I didn't know Mexicans could get good grades. So, that was that. The other thing was that my grammar in English was very good because my grammar in Spanish was very good. I just had a very thick accent, right? So I didn't want to take bonehead English. I wanted to take English literature or American literature because I was just reviewing things that I already knew. And I went to the principal, and the principal told me that because of my accent, I had to take bonehead English.
Wow. So what, because you seem, for a young person, you're asking a lot of, questions that it would take a lot of people to develop the courage to do. So where did you get that motivation to advocate for yourself?
It seemed common sense, I'll give you an example of what I mean. In a biology class, actually in Garden Grove, I asked a question, and the teacher said, I don't understand you. And so I asked it again, and she said, I still don't understand you. But she was saying it in a nice way, not offensively. And so it just seemed common sense to me. I have an accent. I'm speaking. She doesn't understand me. So I told her, don't worry. I'm going to repeat it over and over until you do. And, I wasn't being smart alecky. It was just strictly common sense, right? And she took it that way, and I just kept repeating until she finally understood, and then we just continued from there. But a lot of the stuff that I did was just really common sense. It's like, if I want to be a doctor, then I should be taking these courses. Why aren't I?
How did you, what inspired you to want to become a doctor and to think about college?
That's kind of, before I tell you that, what inspired me, let me tell you something that happened at that school that also opened up my eyes in a different way. There was another boy, another young man that nobody spoke to, and we became very good friends. But that young man was from the South, and he spoke with a Southern accent. So nobody wanted to talk to him either. So he and I became good friends. So I saw the larger context of discrimination, that it wasn't only against me for being Mexican, but it was against anybody who was different. And so that was a big lesson, for me to learn. Anyway, I decided to drive 50 miles a day to go back to my old high school because I couldn't deal with the racism. And I got straight A's except for one B in art. And I'm sure that teacher just didn't like me, so he gave me a B. But I went back to my high school, and the reason why I wanted to be a medical doctor was very personal. When I was born, the doctor that delivered me had to baptize me because I wasn't breathing. And being Catholic, if you die before you're baptized, you go to limbo. He didn't want me to go to limbo. He wanted me to go back to heaven, I guess. So he baptized me with his name, Joaquin. And he said, if you live, I want you to be a doctor like me. So ever since I had consciousness of myself, I was told that story, right? And so I grew up thinking I'm going to be a doctor. So I always read science and biology and this and that. But the other thing is that I was raised very Catholic, and I loved comic books. And in Guadalajara, they had comic books about exemplary lives, about saints, and then about epic lives, about heroes, about Christopher Columbus and Genghis Khan, and you name it, anybody in history that made something, I absorbed all of that. My mother used to call it a vice. I had a vice for reading. I just read everything that I could lay my hands on. And my father taught me how to read and write when I was 6 years old. And so I just read everything. I just devoured everything. So the idea of justice and compassion and taking action and being a hero was driven into me from very early on. But the idea of being a doctor was because I felt that I owed this doctor, some kind of a debt. And the only problem was that I fainted at the sight of blood, so that was going to be hard being a doctor. And I wasn't very good in biology. I had to struggle through biology. But my commitment to this story that was driven into me was such that even after I was in graduate school in philosophy, married with a daughter, I still took the MCAT to get into med school. And I got support, and the people told me you can still make it, but I decided to be a professor instead. And in my own mind, I figure I am a doctor, so my debt is paid.
You have a Ph.D., right?
I have a Ph.D.
So you're a doctor.
So I'm a doctor.
So why, what did you do for your dissertation? And did the Cesar Chavez movement, or just you being in the middle of the Chicano movement, did that inspire your academics post-grad?
Well, that 1 year when I couldn't go to school, when I was in junior high and I couldn't go to junior high, I told my father to bring me philosophy books from Tijuana. And that's all I read was philosophy. So my orientation was always highly theoretical. So even though I was involved in establishing Chicano studies, and I was working in Chicano studies as a student, and then later on, after I got my Ph.D., I was the dean of students in Chicano studies. I didn't major in Chicano studies, I majored in philosophy. And what was important to me was because when I graduated, I got a Ford Fellowship, and I could go and study anywhere in the United States with all of my expenses paid. And I wanted to study Latin American philosophy because I wanted to know what ideas were, important to Latin Americans in terms of philosophy. So I called all the different schools in the United States, and I could not find one single graduate program in philosophy. In fact, at Stanford and Harvard, they told me Latin Americans don't have philosophy. So I wrote my dissertation on European ideas in Mexico, a discourse of the Mexican, a discourse of la filosofía de lo mexicano. And so I actually treated philosophy as a political economy of knowledge, and use the ideas of Michel Foucault that was barely breaking into the scene in terms of the relationship between knowledge and power. And so then I got a postdoctoral, and then I wrote the very first article on postmodern Chicanismo, using postmodernism ideas to look at Chicano studies.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? But before you get into that, can you tell us a little bit about what is Chicano studies?
Chicano studies is an issue-oriented academic discipline, so that instead of, or basically what happened was that when the Chicano movement got started, part of it, say in Los Angeles, because of the walkouts, UCLA only had 80 Chicanos, 80 Mexican Americans in the entire school in 1968. Okay. The only professors, the only people of knowledge that we had were graduate students, right? So the graduate students were very involved in, some of them were involved in the walkouts. They were involved in the Galería de la Raza, self-help graphics, actually, in the whole Chicano Renaissance of the arts, and the critique of social science, the way that it objectified Chicanos and Mexican Americans. But they had a struggle because if you were one of these Chicano graduate students at UCLA in anthropology, like Dr. Loco or Dr. Jose Cuellar, he was in anthropology. When he wanted to look at issues in the barrio, his professor would tell him, you can't do that because that's not anthropology. If they were in political science and they wanted to look at some of the issues and the issues were psychological, they told me, you can't do that because that's not political science. So as I learned later on and connected to that paper that I wrote on Post-Modern Chicanismo, they don't call them disciplines for nothing, right? They discipline your mind to think along very, very strict parameters. And when you step out of that, then you're a heretic. Then you no longer belong, right? So these students then created a field of study called Chicano Studies that was interdisciplinary. So we're looking at unemployment, we're looking at health issues, we're looking at cultural issues, and we don't really care whether it's anthropology or political science or history or whatever. We want to address the problems. And so Chicano Studies is designed to address the problems, to do research, actual research on the problems, so that you end up not only with a theoretical understanding, but also with some kind of a solution. So that's how I define Chicano Studies.
So what is postmodern Chicanismo?
So postmodern Chicanismo, looking at the relationship between power and knowledge, and the key word that Michel Foucault used was discourse. So you have, I guess somebody asked me to explain this in 10 words or less, so let me see if I can do that. So let's say that, in the barrio, people talk, there's a lot of different kinds of conversations going on, right? And those words rise up, and rise up. And then some of those words can be taken up and they can be connected to the legal system. Some words can be connected to the world of art. And so all of these different words can be connected to a lot of different institutions and to a lot of different disciplines. The problem is that from the institutional perspective, the discourse of the institutions themselves, these words don't have any value, right? So that's where the political economy of discourse comes in, is that the danger that I saw in Chicano Studies, and actually my prophecy has proven true, was that Chicano Studies was both an academic discipline and a political movement, right? And the one thing in academia that defines an academic discipline is subjectivity. So when you have politicized knowledge, then it doesn't jive. Then you're a demagogue. You're an ideologue. You're not objective, right? And so the marginalization of Chicano Studies, the eventual marginalization, and in some cases elimination of Chicano Studies, was because of that kind of Achilles heel. And then furthermore, a lot of Chicano, quote unquote, Chicano scholars had to make a hard choice between pursuing Chicano Studies and being true to the movimiento, or proving themselves within their discipline and to their colleagues within the discipline. And it was very difficult to do both. So in many cases, they split away and they just remain within their own disciplines. Some of them did a lot of great work within their disciplines. And in fact, people like David Montejano, he wrote Quixote Soldiers, Sancho's Journal. And this is a good example with David Montejano because he wanted to do his doctoral dissertation on the Chicano movement and they wouldn't let him.
Why not?
Because it wasn't within his field of sociology. Which it really was, but they thought this is a passing thing. So he wrote these books on the Chicano movement 30 years later. This book just came out. He wrote him 30 years later after he was already a highly recognized, famous scholar in sociology. And actually, he got awards from the field of history for his books, because being interdisciplinary, he used a lot of history, right? So anyway, but in order to give power to Chicano Studies, what some scholars decided was that we need to make it very academic, right? And I remember I was part of that group because some people thought of Chicano studies as being folkloric dance and painting and poetry, and that's Chicano studies, right? And we were very cruel, actually. We said, we're into Marxist studies, we're into Marxist economics, we're into Marxist politics, we're not into enchilada studies, right? So people that didn't really understand, like Mario Barrera, another Chicano scholar, said, if there's a nuclear war, the barrio is going to get radiation just like the rest of the city. So we need to learn about international relations. We can't just study the barrio and stay within the barrio. We have to learn everything, right? So there was that kind of trying to make your studies very, very, very academic. But to the point that you make it very academic, then you begin, in some cases, to lose the political movement. And to some extent, that's what's happened. But tying this to Cesar Chavez, what I see in the Chicano movement is that it's just another clothing for a struggle that has been going on since the Mexican-American War. Because early in the 20th century, there were so many strikes from 1900, actually from the 1880s to the 1930s. There were so many strikes. Ricardo Flores de Magón from Mexico came and joined the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, or the Wobblies that they call them. And Ricardo Flores de Magón organized Russian, Italian workers, Mexican-American workers, all over the United States, because it was anarcho-syndicalism. That was the clothing back then, right? But the idea was workers of the world unite, right? The Communist Manifesto. But then things got so bad that the capitalists had to make an agreement and allow for the creation of unions, right? Except in the 1932 National Labor Relations Act, they left out the farm workers because they were considered hobos or family members and not truly workers like the industrial workers. So 30 years, 40 years later, Cesar Chavez has to reinvent the struggle and create a union for farm workers, and that was only in California. Although similar efforts were made in Texas, but it is not a national law that farm workers get recognized as workers.
So around that time, you were very young, obviously, and what was it like for you to live in the time of this movement, one of many? I got so, I told you what my early formation was in terms of Catholicism and history, and the idea of heroic actions, and the notion of justice, right? That made so much sense when I ran into the Chicano movement, because that's what the Chicano movement was after. And so I got thoroughly indoctrinated immediately, I realized that my Mexican identity was too restrictive, because when I went back to Mexico, I couldn't really communicate my ideas anymore, because people in Mexico don't understand what Mexicans have to go through in this country. So I don't know if I understood your question correctly, but the way that it was to me was, what defines Chicanismo is a constant struggle, right?
a constant struggle against injustice. And
So were you closer to that experience than you were to the experience of being Mexican in Mexico, given that you were in both?
I mean, I always tell people I'm Mexican, you know, depending on where I am, right? But when people right off the bat say, "What are you?" I say, "I'm Mexican." If they're mean politically, then I'm Chicano, right? But I think that it was the notion of well, also my studies, you know, for my dissertation, and this is very difficult to swallow, so get ready for this. But I was reading some of the writings of Carlos Fuentes, and he was talking about not his novels, not his fiction, but his essays. And he was talking about how the Spanish language, and this fits very much with Michel Foucault's notions, the discourse, the Spanish language as a discourse of power was infused with feudal kind of society discourses, right? So that speaking Spanish in a way is very liberating, but in another way, in terms of trying to cut to the chase and not get so flowery and lost, English made more sense. And so, you know, to what extent does language even hold you back, right? And so that's probably one of the reasons why I didn't really put my foot down and force my children to learn, you know, Spanish. I figure they learn it if they want to learn it. But the idea is that if you want to be effective in terms of power, then you need to speak power language, whatever it is, right? So of course, when I go to Mexico, of course I speak Spanish, but I don't speak the kind of power Spanish that people speak in Mexico, because my Spanish now has become very limited, right? I mean, my vocabulary is just as big as it ever was, but the specific political lingo that people use, you know, I don't have that. And so that kind of cut me off from a certain aspect of my roots. And the tragedy of being an immigrant is that you never get fully accepted either by Mexicans or by Chicanos or by Anglos. You're always in limbo. So I ended up in limbo anyway.
So it's interesting that you say that. It sounds like there's just multiple identities, or some people might call it the dual identity.
It's more than dual.
And so is that a unique experience in American life, or do you think that having that duality or the multi-identity, is it something that other people can experience?
I think it's a human experience. You know, I just finished reading this book, Sapiens, Brief History of Humankind. And, you know, when the Neanderthals and the Sapiens were roaming the earth, and there were other humanoids, it was a shock for one group of people to meet another group of people. And God forbid if somebody fell in love with a member of the other group, you know, then they had a child, then what identity is that child, right? I mean, it's like Vietnam soldiers that had children in Vietnam, and those children were not accepted by the Vietnamese society. So I think anytime, I mean, the definition of culture is constant change as a culture bumps against another culture. And we cannot avoid that. It's impossible to avoid meeting up with another culture. And so cultural shock and cultural identities and the proliferation of identities, I mean, can you imagine when the Spanish defeated the Aztecs, what kind of culture shock the survivors had to go through in order to go through the phase of being primarily indigenous and then primarily mestizo, right? And then if you think back of the charts and the paintings that the head of the Catholic Church, in the Catholic Church, of all the different castes. So you had a mixture of, black and Chinese, and that gave you a particular child that had a different name from the two of you. And then you had Indian and Spanish mestizo, but then you had the criollo and the cuarteron, and so can you imagine? I mean, there were like 40 different categories of identities. So I think that any time in history you look at anywhere, and I think that the only ones that have the luxury to be pure are the ones that have all the power, or most of the power. Nobody has all the power. Because they can just make it so. Como la canción, mi palabra es la ley, right? Mm-hmm. I am pure because I say so, and if you don't agree with me, I'll kill you. So, we grant them the right to be pure. But there is no cultural purity.
Would you say, is there a relationship between, having all these different identities? Is there a connection between that and the Chicano movement?
Oh, yeah. I actually, let me just say that I don't think that I'm unique. I mean, I'm unique in the sense that being a migrant made me unique because I experienced that since I left Guadalajara at 5 to go to Cheyenne, Wyoming. That was a big shock. So, but I think that what makes me different because of my migrant experience is that I'm aware of my multiple identities. Everybody has multiple identities, they're just not aware of them. Or they don't want to recognize them, or they're afraid of them. But usually what I tell people, there's a famous novel by Julio Cortázar called Around the Day in 80 Worlds. Not around the world in 80 days, but around the day in 80 worlds. And from there, what I got was when people ask me, what are you? My answer is, what time is it? Because depending on where I am and what time it is, I can be Hispanic, I can be Jalisciense, Tapatio, Mexicano, Chicano. I have multiple identities.
You mentioned earlier that, the Chicano movement was very politicized, and that could potentially make it not unpopular, but not as apparent as it was in the 60s. Given what is going on right now with politics and the new administration, where do you see this movement going?
Well, I think that, movements happen because there are injustices. Okay? As long as there is injustice against people who are considered Mexican, there will be a movement. There was another clothing of the movement, which was the bilingual education movement, right? So whether we call it the Chicano movement or we don't call it the Chicano movement, we call it the Latino movement or the Latinx movement, or the bilingual movement, it's important to understand that those are just names. The Chicano movement, in the sense that it's a movement against injustice, we may not in the future call it the Chicano movement. But it will be the Chicano movement, just like the Chicano movement is not just the Chicano movement, is the movement for equal rights for workers. I mean, really, when you get down to it, that's what puts food on your table, is having a job, right? So having the right to work and having dignity, right? But there's also another aspect of the Chicano movement that part of it was because Rudy Acuña, he wrote a piece called Anything But Mexican, right? Because a lot of Chicanos don't like to be called Mexican, because Mexican is a bad word. And so we go back to the whole discourse thing, right? So Chicanos, you know, I remember reading about how Chicanos were really upset that nobody had ever done anything, you know, for la causa, you know, and they had no historical memory of all of the struggles that had happened beforehand. So they just assumed that they invented la revolución, right? I mean, the nearest memory from their grandfathers was la Revolución Mexicana, right? So yeah, we remember that, but that was in Mexico. Nobody remembered all of the struggles of Mexican Americans in this country since the Mexican-American War. I mean, nobody remembered the Cortina War, right? Cortina was one of the early Tejanos that rose up against, you know, he wanted to restart the Mexican War because he wasn't happy with the results, right? So, I mean, those struggles have been going on. The Chicano movement just called the movement Chicano. But the Chicano movement is not the essence of the entire struggle. It's more like the particular clothing. So those of us who wore the clothing, of course we attach to it, but I think it's wrong to say, well, you're not really part of the Chicano movement, even though you're fighting for fair housing. It's like, that's dumb. You know, I mean, if you're fighting for fair housing for Chicanos, you are part of the Chicano movement. You may not have any recollection, you may not even know the word Chicano, but it's the same struggle that has been going on even before the word Chicano was around. Does that make sense?
Yeah. There's, you know, you've seen there's been a lot of wave of protests, and I'm noticing that the Latino community, you know, they're participating in the protests. And so it looks like, you know, the struggle is up in arms again. What would you recommend, you know, for an aspiring person that wants to get involved in social change? Like, what words of inspiration and wisdom could you share with someone that is seeing the injustices and in some way wants to help and change that?
You know, whether you're a student with a particular goal in mind in terms of a career, or whether you're a civic-minded person that wants to be an active citizen, what you need to understand is that, remember how I was telling you about words and conversations that are going on? Mm-hmm. Well, there's always a conversation going on about what you're interested in. But you have to find it, and you have to join it, and you have to learn the language that is used in that conversation. You have to learn the concepts that are used in that conversation. And then once you become conversant, then you make your move. Then you make your contribution. You know, one of the saddest things was when a lot of pochos came face to face with the Chicano movement and realized that they've been cheated out of their heritage. And then all of a sudden they wanted to kill every white person in sight, you know, because they had all this anger that they didn't speak Spanish, they were robbed of their heritage, they didn't know their culture, they were mad at their parents, they were mad at the world, they were mad at everybody, and that doesn't make a movement, you know. You need strategy, you need tactics, you need planning, you need the art of negotiation, like you know, we talked about before, and you know, politics is the art of the possible. It's like, what can we do with what we have to move forward, right? So if you're interested, no matter how old you are, there's if you read the news, if you listen to the radio, people are always talking about there's a meeting here, there's a meeting there, right? But if you're the kind of person that says, "Oh, I don't like politics," well, then you're basically erasing yourself from any kind of activism. So you can begin almost anywhere, and then the path will open up to you in terms of where is, your own sense of values, where do they fit in with a particular group, or maybe they don't, right? I mean, there are people, that's why we have a whole gamut of political positions. Some people are, it seems, almost by nature, conservative. And some people are very, very liberal, right? Where do you belong? Because you can be active as a conservative or you can be active as a liberal. Because you never know when the political situation is going to unite both of you for the same cause, and then disunite you for other causes. But attend meetings, attend city hall meetings, look at people that look like you or that speak like you, and I'm talking about conceptually, not necessarily the language, and then ask them out for coffee or just